A notification arrives on 7 million phones at once. It isn't an advertisement. It is a government alert. In a bustling Tel Aviv cafe, the hum of conversation stops. Every face is lit by the same cold glow. The message is simple, bureaucratic, and final. The National Early Warning Network has been destroyed. The defensive buffer they trusted, 15, sometimes 25 minutes, has collapsed. The new warning time for incoming missile attack is just 60 to 90 seconds. A father looks at his children across the table. He understands. 90 seconds isn't time to find shelter. It is only time to count. This is not a defense system anymore. That's a countdown clock. And for the architects of this collapse, that clock is ticking exactly as they designed it. This failure was not an accident. It was the calculated result of a 20-year strategy. To understand how this was achieved, you must first understand the physics of attrition they mastered, while the West was still celebrating its own technology. That physics of attrition isn't a spontaneous event. It's the execution of a meticulously designed 45-year plan. To understand the countdown clock, you have to understand the blueprint behind it. The strategy was always two-phased. Phase 1. Blind the eyes. For years, the focus was on developing the specific capabilities required to neutralize the West's most advanced radar and sensor networks, the very systems whose failure we just witnessed. Then Phase 2. Exhaust the fists. This is a battle of economics, not just technology. The doctrine is to overwhelm a finite stockpile of multi-million-dollar defensive missiles with a relentless swarm of cheap, mass-produced drones and rockets. The defender faces an unwinnable equation. They go bankrupt long before the attacker runs out of ammunition, and this entire organism is controlled by a nervous system built for survival. It's not a centralized hierarchy. It's a distributed network of over 30 regional command centers designed to coordinate these swarm attacks, even if the central leadership is taken offline. This is the physical reality. And while this architecture was being built, the official narrative in the West, from leaders and analysts, sounded something like this. Iran's regime is brittle, its leadership is in turmoil, and its capabilities are severely limited by sanctions. The gap between that story and the physics was growing into a canyon. The architecture of collapse was complete. The system was loaded and aimed. All it was waiting for was a single, miscalculated political move to serve as the trigger. And that trigger was pulled not by a major power, but by a junior partner convinced it had their backing. In a command bunker in Bahrain, home to the US Fifth Fleet, the air was thick with a mixture of forced bravado and a deep, ancestral fear. The consoles hummed, but the real sound was the silent screaming of decades of precedent being broken. This was the moment a pawn made a king's move. The button they pushed was a button their fathers and grandfathers had built entire careers on never, ever touching. For the first time in the modern era, a Gulf state launched a direct, overt missile and drone attack from its own soil against Iran. A shadow war fought for 45 years through proxies and sabotage had just become a hot war. It was a catastrophic miscalculation, born from alliance pressure and a fundamental misunderstanding of the board. They had bought into a narrative of strength while ignoring the physics of attrition that Iran had spent half a century perfecting. The red line was crossed. In that moment, the attack wasn't the loudest thing in the region. The loudest thing was the silence that followed. The terrifying, deafening pause as a pre-planned, region-wide retaliation system woke up. The question was no longer if Iran would respond, it was simply when and how. The answer to when was immediate. The answer to how was with a precision that was absolute. There was no debate, no warning. The deafening silence was simply replaced by the sound of physics rendering its verdict. Within minutes, the night sky over Manama was lit, not by city lights, but by the incoming streaks of dozens of missiles. Explosions echoed across the bay as they impacted, not randomly, but on the very infrastructure that had enabled the initial attack. Port facilities, airfields, command centers. This was not a token response. It was a calculated amputation, a demonstration of force designed to make an example of Bahrain, serving as a terrifying warning to any other nation watching from the sidelines. For Bahrain, the war was immediate and total. But for the rest of the world, a single cold question now hung in the air. Was this the final move in a deadly chess game? Or was it merely the first? The answer comes in a single, terrifying wave. The calculated strike on Bahrain was not the final move. It was the opening salvo. In the very same night, the physics of the situation are rewritten. Iran unleashes a pre-planned, coordinated, multi-front attack, hitting targets in 4 other nations simultaneously: Iraq, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. This is the full, shocking revelation of the 45-year plan in action. The capacity for simultaneous warfare across the entire theater is no longer a theory. The illusion of containment is shattered. In Dubai, the reflection of distant explosions flashes silently against the glass of the Burj Khalifa. Down below, the scream of supercars is not for show, but for escape. Air raid sirens, a sound this city never expected to hear, wail over the fountains and the 5-star hotels. Emergency government text alerts light up millions of phones in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, in Doha, and in Riyadh. Stay indoors, stay away from windows. The modern, gleaming hubs of global commerce, the insulated bubbles of international wealth, have just become war zones. 5 nations hit in a single night. Is this the calculated masterstroke of a 45-year plan, or a desperate gamble that will inevitably backfire? Share your analysis in the comments. What we are witnessing is something analysts at groups like the Critical Threats Project have modelled for years: a proven capability to execute coordinated multi-line barrages. This isn't chaos. This is a definitive, engineered proof that American and allied deterrence in the region has utterly failed. The physical battlefield is now defined by fire and collapsing infrastructure. But the more important question is the one that now appears on the strategic map. For the superpower whose entire deterrence architecture just evaporated in a single night, what is the next move? As the architecture of American deterrence in the Middle East lay in ruins, the superpower's response arrived. Not with a reassessment of this new reality, but with a doubling down on the old one. The Trump administration announced it was sending a 3rd aircraft carrier strike group into the region. Publicly, the move was framed as a show of force, the ultimate tool of coercion. They called it leverage, designed to force Iran to the negotiating table to compel surrender. But the physics of the battle space had been fundamentally altered. What Washington called leverage, the new battlefield realities called a massive, high-value target. This is where the gap between narrative and physics becomes a chasm. While President Trump publicly claimed Iran was on the verge of collapse and would soon capitulate, a different kind of signal was emerging from Tehran. The contrast is stark. As the Gulf burned, as global commerce reeled, Iran's government calmly announced it was proceeding with the formal succession process for its supreme leader. There was no panic, no hint of collapse. Just the quiet, orderly mechanics of a state securing its command structure for the long term. According to reports from sources like the Washington Post, the process was executed with an efficiency that proved profound institutional resilience. Meanwhile, the political theatre continued. The United Kingdom, in a gesture of solidarity, placed its own carrier, the HMS Prince of Wales, on heightened readiness for deployment. This political signal, however, did not alter the military physics. It simply added another multi-billion-dollar target to a theatre its owners could no longer control. This is the concept of alliance drain in motion, allies contributing not to security but to shared vulnerability. The CSIS analysis from this period is clinical. Deploying carriers into a known hypersonic threat envelope, what they call an A2AD environment, is the definition of high-risk exposure. Washington was calling this leverage. Tehran was calling it a target. And while history will eventually render its verdict, the physics already have an opinion. This defines the strategic absurdity of the moment. But the consequences are not merely strategic, they are tangible and they are economic. The question now becomes, how does a war fought on a tactical map become a war on the global economy, and a war on your wealth? The war on the map translates to a war on the global economy through a single primary vector: energy, specifically through the world's most critical choke point, the Strait of Hormuz, where 20% of global oil and LNG must transit. This isn't theory. The physics already have an opinion. When this artery is threatened, as it was during the escalations, prices don't nudge upwards, they spike. We saw a direct precursor to this in the Red Sea, where Houthi attacks cut container traffic by over 70%, helping to surge global freight rates more than 30%. These are not abstract risks. They are direct observable signals of systemic inflation being transmitted into the global economy, eroding wealth far faster than leaders will admit. This is the real strategy. It is not just military, it is a model of pure economic attrition. The goal is not simply to win a single engagement, but to bankrupt the opponent by exploiting a profound cost imbalance. This is where supposed technological superiority becomes a compounding financial liability. The math is brutally simple. For every low-cost drone Iran or its proxies launch, costing perhaps $20,000, defenders are forced to expend a multi-million-dollar interceptor. A single Patriot missile costs $4 million. That is a cost ratio of 200 to 1. This isn't a battle. It's an economic bleed-out, systematically draining finite Western stockpiles and treasuries, not to achieve victory, but simply to break even for another day. This model, where technological hubris is bled dry by asymmetric reality, is not new. In fact, it is a direct echo of an empire's single worst military disaster. A ghost from history that explains not just the strategy, but the systemic blindness that enables it. That ghost has a name: the fall of Singapore in February 1942. In the minds of Winston Churchill's government, it was an impregnable fortress, the Gibraltar of the East. Its power was symbolized by a line of massive 15-inch naval guns, their barrels pointing defiantly out to sea, ready to obliterate any naval force that dared to approach. It was a monument to a specific theory of war. But the physics of the real attack had a different opinion. The Japanese assault, led by General Yamashita, didn't come from the sea. It came from behind. It moved through the supposedly impassable jungles of the Malayan Peninsula. The British had dismissed the terrain as a tactical impossibility. The Japanese used it as a highway, with thousands of soldiers using simple bicycles for rapid, silent movement, flowing around the fortress's static defences like water. First, Britain's prize battleships, sent to defend the fortress, were sunk from the air, a precursor of the asymmetric threat. Then, in just 70 days, the entire defense collapsed. You can just picture it. Those giant proud guns still pointing at an empty ocean, while behind them over 80,000 exhausted British, Indian and Australian troops surrendered to a Japanese force less than half their size. Churchill, who had placed absolute faith in the strategy, called it what it was: the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. His own physician noted months later that the Prime Minister was still haunted, remarking, "I cannot get over Singapore." It was a catastrophic failure of imagination, a deeply held narrative of superiority that was shattered by the simple physics of a new way of war. The parallel is undeniable. The physics are clear. What, then, is the final inescapable verdict for the current global system, and for your capital? The final verdict is this: the conflict has engineered an impossible strategic dilemma for the United States. The only physical solution that could de-escalate the crisis, a full withdrawal of military presence from the region, is the one action that is politically untenable for any American administration to admit, let alone execute. The official narrative cannot accommodate a retreat. Trapped between a politically impossible solution and a militarily unwinnable reality, the West is left with no good moves. The physics of attrition have an opinion, and they have cornered the board. The countdown clock that began in Israel is now ticking for the entire global system. The world may not have voted for this war, but it is paying for it anyway. Its economy and its security are now held hostage by a crisis it can neither control nor afford. You didn't choose this. Your portfolio didn't choose this. But the physics of this new reality don't care. The drains on the system are now observable, and the timelines do not lie. Navigating this new era requires seeing the gap between the narrative and the physics. If you want to continue receiving this kind of evidence-based analysis to protect what you've built, subscribe now and activate notifications.